It is our great delight and privilege to welcome Professor Elaine James of Princeton Theological Seminary to lead us in our reflections this morning. I'm grateful for the gift of her time and to the clergy continuing ed, to Hugh Brown in particular, for arranging this. And now turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation to be here. It's a pleasure. I'm going to be talking today about the book of Ecclesiastes. I think that it offers us a meditation on wisdom that is particularly apropos of our current moment in this very strange and disorienting year. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And I hope that you can all see it. I'm also going to have some help monitoring the chat. So if, actually, as I'm seeing this now, I'm just noting that I actually can't see the chat screen right now. So please do feel free to put things in the chat and I will have some help monitoring those as we go along. So nothing new under the sun: wisdom, traditions, endurance, and hope. These are our themes for today. And I hope that you'll find here something of use. Ecclesiastes isn't really known for being super hopeful, but I'm going to try to persuade you that this can still be a text that offers us a vision for moving forward in a holistic way. So our time this morning, I have separated it into two different sessions. So the first session here, we're starting just a little bit late, but this is going to go till about 10:45, nothing new under the sun, and then we'll break for a group discussion. And then we'll come back for a second session, Hope and the Ethics of Enjoyment, which will start around 11, and that will be followed by a second group discussion then from 11:30 to 11:45. So my first talk here will have, I think, three parts: wisdom, traditions in the biblical world, Ecclesiastes as a book of contradictions, and then Hevel, vanity and breath, dust and death is a major theme in the book of Ecclesiastes. And we'll see how far we get in section 3 before we need to break this morning. So my title, Nothing New Under the Sun, is a famous line, of course, from the book's opening poem. Perhaps you, like many people I know and have experienced this year, a peculiar shift in your relationship to time. Without our usual daily and weekly markers of time, tradition, gathering, and dispersal, each day can feel a little bit like that movie Groundhog Day, right? Nothing is new under the sun. And yet it has also been a year in which everything is new. Been forced to reckon with new realities, new technologies, new habits, new losses. For those of us who have been blessed to be healthy, we are saturated in the dailiness of our daily lives. So I'm going to talk a little bit about wisdom traditions and how they help us speak to that quality of dailiness. So wisdom literature is well known. It's found universally across the ancient world, as well as in our biblical texts. It is associated with sages, wise figures known for their knowledge and what the Bible calls counsel. We have in the text of especially Proverbs, Job, and Ecclesiastes, a really strong tradition of what we call wisdom counsel. And these, unlike the narratives and laws of the Torah, which remark upon the particular relationship of Israel and its God, these texts tend to emphasize the universality of human experience. So here in Jeremiah 18, we have an allusion to a recognized division of knowledge. Instruction or Torah shall not perish from the priest, nor counsel from the wise, nor a word from the prophet. So sages, the wise here, are seen to have a unique intellectual contribution. In these books, these wisdom books, we see a certain density of interest in the language of wisdom. The Hebrew root for wisdom occurs like 183 times in these books, as does a certain concern just for moral decision making in general. My point here is to note that the distinction, so unlike prophecy and the religious professionalism of the priesthood, wisdom is not concerned so much with the mighty works of God in history, but focuses rather on how a person may cope with the challenges of one's immediate experiences in the world. Daily life is what matters most in wisdom literature, as so in the book of Ecclesiastes. And so I suggest that what it offers us actually is a theology of everyday life, which is where most of us, of course, spend most of our time. Now, in the book of Proverbs, I'm going to talk a little bit about Proverbs first to set up a contrast with the book of Ecclesiastes. In the book of Proverbs, we encounter the most quintessential or even conventional book of wisdom. We get many specific instructions here, and it's a language that is directed towards sons, which is common in wisdom literature across the ancient Near East. And so we hear the opening of the book of Proverbs, "Hear, my child, your father's instruction, and do not reject your mother's teaching." It reminds us that the principal audience for wisdom in the ancient world was young men, but that there's this larger goal within wisdom literature of instructing and socializing the child, are put in the position ourselves of being children who learn at the feet of our teachers here. For Proverbs, the goal of human life is therefore moving toward maturity. So it's filled with the rules and maxims that are pragmatic and didactic. In the book of Proverbs, experience is a source of wisdom, and it comports with the orderliness of the world that we can observe. So in Proverbs 6, we hear, "Go to the ant, you lazy bones, consider its ways and be wise. Without having any chief or officer or ruler, it prepares its food in summer and gathers its sustenance in harvest." Another recognizable form that predominates in Proverbs, but also appears in other texts, are the short two-line sayings. The saying is a traditional form of knowledge that enshrines cultural values and inscribes a course of moral decision-making. Better to meet a she-bear robbed of its cubs than to confront a fool immersed in folly, right? It's hard to forget an image like that. So these texts often rely on contrast and binary thinking to exemplify a theology of retribution. So God is not to blame for human suffering, rather, humans are. You can hear already some of the central themes of the wisdom literature as I'm talking here. And these are confidence in the order of the cosmos, right? So if you do good, good things will happen. If you keep the company of fools, you can imagine foolish or bad things will happen. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. So acting in accordance with the divine will is the source of knowledge for how to live our daily lives. And there are two paths in life. Especially for the book of Proverbs, these two paths are key. So a key text that helps us illustrate is this very famous saying in Proverbs 2, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him and he will make your paths smooth. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and shun evil." So notice the sense of cosmic order here. Trusting in the Lord will be rewarded. He will make your paths smooth. The fear of the Lord is the essence of wisdom. And the path alluded to here is the path of wisdom or righteousness. Other texts point out by way of contrast that the path of the fool or unrighteousness leads to destruction, violence, and even death. So this kind of two binary black and white thinking is characteristic of our wisdom literature. In fact, when I was teaching undergraduates, they loved this book. And these are young people, and they'd say, "Oh, this is just like what my parents always told me." Walk on the right path. It's like karma, you know, there's a sense of the cosmos is ordered in such a way that goodness is rewarded and badness is also punished. Now, the book of Ecclesiastes takes up these very same themes, but it has a more radical stance. But this stance is not simply a rejection of these conventional wisdom traditions. Rather, the book of Ecclesiastes holds them up as subjects of speculation and asks whether and in what circumstances they might be true. So I suggest that Ecclesiastes is really a book of contradictions. The book as a whole manifests no discernible organization. There's not a clear design or structure. This is a signal to us that it is not a work of systematic thought. It's a mix of poetry and prose. And in between, we get a mix of wisdom sayings, reflections on life and labor, and many repeated themes and phrases. There's a repeated motif of the preacher or the teacher, whoever it is we imagine the speaker to be of the book of Ecclesiastes, conversing with his own heart, as in 2:1. I said to myself, come now, I will make a test of pleasure. So thoughtful, reflective consideration, a willingness to scrutinize both his life and his received wisdom about life is a hallmark of this work, but it also contributes to the work's contradictory quality. Taken together, these features contribute to an overall sense of intellectual inscrutability, echoed by this thematic refrain, all is vanity and a chasing after the wind. The text wrestles with these received wisdom traditions as when it cites aphorisms, only to subvert them. So the wise have eyes in their head, but fools walk in darkness, for example, is presented as a basic truth, but then it's contested in the very next line. Yet I perceive that the same fate befalls all of them. So the tone here is skeptical, and it's studded with lines that counsel resignation and the enjoyment of daily pleasures. Go eat your bread with enjoyment and drink your wine with a merry heart, for God has long ago approved what you do. In fact, early rabbis considered excluding it from the book, or from the canon of scripture, because they said it is too full of contradictions. Now, this preacher's appeal to vanity, that in Hebrew is hevel, is a signal for what some interpreters take to be an overall program of pessimism. You can see here that the way vanity is interpreted is alongside the skull, right, as a figure for mortality. The ultimate ends of the human subject are here. I said in my heart with regard to human beings that God is testing them to show that they are but animals. For the fate of humans and the fate of animals is the same. As one dies, so the other. They all have the same breath, and humans have no advantage over the animals. For all is vanity. All go to one place. All are from the dust, and all return to dust again. That's Ecclesiastes 3:18 through 20. So this figure of mortality is really key for Ecclesiastes. And this participation in the inevitability of mortality as part of the cycles of the natural world is the subject of the book's opening poem. I put it up here on your screen in my own translation, mostly for fun, but also because I wanted to highlight some of the dimensions of mortality that I see, and perhaps to make it a little bit less familiar to you, so you might hear it in a fresh way. As I read through this and in the rest of my presentation, I'm going to spend some time just reading the text out loud. I think that is a pleasure and a privilege of being a Bible scholar, but also being in community is hearing and listening to the word together. So what value for a human is all his toil at which he toils under the sun? A generation goes, a generation comes, and the land is ever standing. The sun rises, the sun sets, and for its place it is yearning. Therefore it rises again. Going to the south, circling to the north, circling, circling goes the wind. By its circuits returns the wind. All streams are going to the sea, but the sea is not full. To the place where the streams go, there they return to go again. All things are wearisome. A human cannot describe it. The eye is not satisfied by seeing. The ear is not fulfilled by hearing. What has been will be, and what has been done will be done. There is nothing new under the sun. Is there anything of which it is said, look there, something new? It already existed in the eternity that came before us. There is no memorial for the first, nor will there be for the last. There will be no memorial for the first among those who are the last. You can see here the skepticism about human work, toil, is translated here. Our work participates in an endless cycle of the natural world, a cycle of perpetual movement, going and return, rising and falling. The repetition of the Hebrew root savav, which is to go around, I've tried to evoke it by the repeated word circle that you see in the lines about the wind. This activity of the wind, endlessly circling with no beginning, no end, no discernible purpose, evokes the endless cycle of human work. This is true not just in an individual human life in which we work and die and ultimately will be forgotten. Don't worry, this is a little bleak, but we're moving toward hope, I promise. But this is also true, according to this text, not just for individuals, but for humanity as a whole, whose fate is matched by the coursing of water. All streams are going to the sea, but the sea is not full. The poem itself offers for scrutiny a kind of pessimism, and yet I would also resist its own deep pessimism. I find this to be one of the most haunting poems in the Bible, full of careful repetitions, evocations of the natural world, correlations of life and time within a spectrum of observed kinship. Yet there is a deep sense of resignation. All things are wearisome. A human cannot describe it. And yet the poem has described it. There's nothing new under the sun, except that now, thanks to the poet who's written this for us, something is new. There's a poem that did not exist before, which offers us an occasion to gather, to reflect, to feel that we are not alone in the seemingly endless daily cycle of our lives that follow the sun, that blow like the wind, that flow like the coursing of great waters, in which we do our work. Work that, like the ocean, we cannot see the end or the meaning of. We are sobered by the brutal honesty of these last lines. There will be no memorial for the first among those who are last. These lines remind me of the Quaker practice of unmarked or extremely minimal headstones at graves, a burial practice that intentionally embraces human finitude as an ethical imperative and as a spiritual discipline. But as I've already said, Ecclesiastes is a book of contradictions. I promised that we would be moving towards hope. So a second reading of the book is possible, one that is highly optimistic and lands on the repeated refrain that we find in the book: there is nothing better for people under the sun than to eat and drink and enjoy themselves. O youth, enjoy yourself while you are young. This image that I have on the screen here is taken from an illustrated children's Bible, which is an illustration of this exact passage. Its title is Rejoice in Your Youth. I personally am amused by the idea that the ancient sage who wrote Ecclesiastes might have had exactly this image in mind. But 8 times in the book, there is this commendation of enjoyment. Might these be signals then that we might think of Ecclesiastes as a preacher of joy? Here we turn to another key text in the book. I won't read this entire one because it's quite lengthy and I hope quite familiar, but to everything, a season, a time for every matter under heaven. I'll go to the end here: a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love, a time to hate, a time for war, a time for peace. And then we get these lines: everything God makes beautiful in its time, or his time perhaps. And he puts eternity in the mortal heart without their finding what God has done from first to last. This I know, there is no good for them except to rejoice and to do good in their lifetime. Moreover, to eat and to drink and to see the good in one's work, this is a gift from God. Now, we would be hard-pressed to see this as a poem of pure joy. The prodding towards joy happens after the lengthy reflection on the variability of human life. In this catalog of time, the poet sets up a whole bunch of contrasts. There's an almost rigid structure to the poem. Each line follows this deliberate parallelism as it arranges its antithetical pairs, right? Born, die, plant, pluck up, kill, heal. But this gesture towards order is almost, I think it's sort of elusive. As much as it beckons us to see order and meaning, it also thwarts it. So interpreters have repeatedly attempted to discover an underlying structure to this poem, but the poem moves in this almost random trajectory. It's hard to make sense of why these pairs occur in this order. This itself is part of the meaningful experience of the poem. It resists our attempts to control it, which serves as a reminder or a metaphor for the inability of humans to predict or order our times or our seasons, despite our best efforts. They are simply beyond our control. The catalog is followed by an affirmation that this too is beautiful. Its beauty lies in the inscrutable divine will that is beyond human intellect. We find ourselves with both a taste of eternity and in perennial pursuit of the eternity that persists in eluding us. In such a situation of unknowability and human finitude, the preacher affirms one thing: this I know, there is no good for them except to rejoice and do good in their lifetime. And the corollary: eat, drink, and see the goods in one's work. This is a gift from God. The prominence of the gift in Ecclesiastes, the divine grant of pleasure in the midst of the vexing nature of human life, does not let us be resigned to fatalism. It insists instead on a realistic assessment of our frailty and an attitude of faithful acceptance of the goodness we encounter in our daily lives, a goodness that we did not create, but comes always and only from God. Finally, I'll talk a little bit about this word, hevel, the word that we usually translate vanity. Hevel is this thematic word. It is an epigram that frames the book. It occurs right at the beginning in verse 1 and right at the very end in chapter 12. The dominant translation is vanity, although it has also been translated the absurd or absurdity, what is incomprehensible. It is vapor, breath, what is beyond mortal grasp. A friend of mine likes to say that hevel is raking leaves on a windy day. You might have an experience in your own life that provides an apt metaphor. What do you think of as hevel? Well, let me, here's another wonderful children's Bible illustration. There is not a lot of high art on the book of Ecclesiastes, but there are a lot of children's illustrations. As I said, this didactic quality of wisdom literature makes it apt for helping people think about teaching children. So you see here, hevel is actually nicely represented by these little bubbles, right? Bubbles that might pop at any moment that float on the wind. And here they are given names: fashion, sudden riches, fame, office, right? The things we pursue that we can never fully grasp. But here at the end of Ecclesiastes, we have this charge: remember your creator in the days of your youth. I'm trying to decide if I should read this. I will read it. It's a bit lengthy and we're coming near the end of our time, so that I think it's worthwhile. Okay. Remember your creator in the days of your youth, before the days of trouble come and the years draw near when you will say, I have no pleasure in them. Before the sun and light and moon and stars are darkened and the clouds return with the rain, in the day when the guards of the house tremble and the strong men are bent and the women who grind cease working because they are few, and those who look through the windows see dimly. When the doors on the street are shut, the sound of the grinding is low, and one rises up at the sound of a bird, and all the daughters of song are brought low. When one is afraid of heights and terrors are in the road, the almond tree blossoms, the grasshopper drags itself along, and desire fails, because all must go to their eternal home, and the mourners will go about in the streets. Before the silver cord is snapped, and the golden bowl is broken, and the pitcher is broken at the fountain, and the wheel is broken at the cistern, and the dust returns to the earth as it was, and the breath returns to God who gave it. Vanity of vanities, says the teacher, all is vanity. So vanity, dust, breath, and this apocalyptic meditation that closes the poem, I don't know, I find this especially chilling. It's especially chilling. All that exists returns to where it began. Again, not just individual human lives, but all life is extinguished. This ability to imagine the end of human existence is perhaps the skill we need during our current ecological crisis. I'm not sure. We find ourselves, though, in a precarious moment in which we have so destroyed the Earth's capacity for self-renewal and made it uninhabitable for other creatures and perhaps eventually almost ourselves, that our future extinction may be precipitously near. Certainly, this apocalyptic kind of vision helps us to imagine a world in which we no longer exist. Human cultures, too, are broken. It's the brokenness of human cultures is offered in 4 arresting images. The silver cord is snapped. The golden bowl is broken. The pitcher is broken at the fountain. The wheel is broken at the cistern. It is a radical return to the theme that opened the book. But here the cycles of nature are also broken and stopped. We are arrested here at the book's end. And it is perhaps an appropriate text to help us think about our own approach toward Good Friday. The book asks us to remember that we too are Hevel. We are dust. So I have on offer for you a series of discussion questions, and I think we'll have about a little over 10 minutes for discussion. And these are the questions. So I would like you to, these are just my suggestions. You could talk about whatever you want to, obviously, but here are my suggestions for what you might think of to discuss. So how has the last year revealed that there is nothing new under the sun in your daily life and ministry? What effect does it have to frame the whole book with these two striking texts that foreground the cyclical nature of the world, ephemerality, and the pall of mortality? How does the eschatological resignation of Ecclesiastes 12, which I just read, when the earth humanity will pass away, offer a template for Holy Week? And what are the ecological implications of this kind of thinking? So welcome back. If you can all go ahead and mute your mics, we'll get started with our second session. I'm going to share my screen here again with you. So in this second part, I want to talk a little bit more. I left you in sort of not a place of despair, I don't think, but with some of the sober realities of the book of Ecclesiastes. Here in the second session, I want to talk a little bit more about hope and enjoyment and its prominence in the book. So I want to cover three things here. The first is the theme of enjoyment in the book of Ecclesiastes. The second is the repeated theme of labor and what I've called the vexation of labor as a sort of problematic for the writer. And third, then, to talk about some of the freighted ethical choices that we confront in reading the book of Ecclesiastes and how they might relate to the fear of God, which you'll recall is this prominent theme in wisdom literature, and no less so the case here in Ecclesiastes. Again, I'll talk for a few minutes, and then we will break for another small group discussion. So to our first theme, the theme of enjoyment in Ecclesiastes. It is tempting perhaps to think about Ecclesiastes' injunctions to be delighted as a kind of jaded resignation, like, well, nothing is meaningful, therefore I might as well just take pleasure where I can. Or perhaps to see joy as yet another obligation. I better buck up and get to feeling better. It's a new kind of existential duty, perhaps, or an imposition in light of altogether depressing circumstances. But I want to consider this injunction to enjoyment, to delight, with a bit more detail in order to ask what it is that the book imagines enjoyment to be and how it coexists with Hevel, with vanity, and the acknowledgement of the tragic quality of human life. So to do that, I want to call your attention to another key text. This is from Ecclesiastes 9, verses 7 through 10. Go eat your bread with enjoyment and drink your wine with a merry heart, for God has long ago approved what you do. Let your garments always be white. Do not look lacking on your head. Enjoy life with the wife whom you love all the days of your vain life that are given you under the sun, because that is your portion in life and in your toil at which you toil under the sun. Whatever your hand finds to do, do with all your might, for there is no work or thought of knowledge or wisdom in Sheol to which you are going. This text and the book more broadly uses a number of different metaphors for enjoyment. Notice what being joyful looks like here, according to Ecclesiastes. Enjoyment is not merely a disposition, it's not merely an attitude or an emotion. Rather, enjoyment involves a number of behaviors that signify, invite, and embody the experience of joy in the midst of tragic circumstances. These include eating and drinking, donning white, bright garments, anointing one's head with oil, and being with one's beloved. There is a behavioral dimension to joy. It is both specialized and ritualized. These are the kinds of behaviors that also serve as signals in the Hebrew Bible of the end of a cycle of mourning. So think about when David completes his mourning for Bathsheba's son, for example. 2 Samuel 12 says this: David rose from the ground, washed, anointed himself, and changed his clothes. He went into the house of the Lord and worshiped. He then went to his own house, and when he asked, they set food before him, and he ate. These are all of the same gestures that Ecclesiastes is talking about. These gestures are practices in its consistent affirmation that these are behaviors that make up joy. Do not live in mourning despite your tragedy, the text counsels. Take up these practices that inculcate gratitude and enjoyment. Eat and drink, change your clothes, anoint yourself, rejoin your community, and celebrate with those you love. These actions are a signal of the boundary between the living and the dead. Where throughout the book, Hevel is the signal of the obscure boundary between the dust that we once were and the dust that we will become, the practices of enjoyment tell us that we can signal our own lives to ourselves, meaningfully marking the transition from grieving over death to reincorporating ourselves in life. Signaling life in this way is to call forth the power of our actions to stake out the space and time of the living, in contrast to the forces and powers of mortality that sometimes seem to stalk our days. In the image here that I have selected, which you see is an illustration of this very text, the artist brings Ecclesiastes into conversation with Jesus's teaching about the lilies in Luke 12. Consider the lilies, how they grow. They toil not, they spin not, and yet I say unto you, Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. To clothe oneself in white, as a lily does, is to let go of anxiety and grief and the constant vexation of toil, and to reject the politics of death that threaten to overwhelm. For those of us experiencing the long winter of quarantine, gathering with loved ones may be just the signal of life that we were prevented from doing. When we are cut off from our usual behavioral rituals of joy, we find ourselves in a difficult situation. How do we construct meaningful behaviors and practices that help us remember that we are the living? One primary way might be in our attitude toward precisely those gifts that sustain our bodily lives. We must eat and drink in order to survive. How we eat and drink then becomes a matter of central importance. So what the preacher here says most often about our enjoyment is that there is nothing better than the basic activities that sustain human life and make it meaningful. Eating and drinking, working and resting, being with one's beloved, these simple and mundane gestures reveal the giftedness of life and make life worth living. Throughout Ecclesiastes, there are other signals of enjoyment that are also linked to behavior. These serve as reminders that enjoyment is not merely something that happens to us as a matter of circumstance and good fortune, nor is it simply an attitude that we put on, as if we could will ourselves into our own happiness. Instead, the book charts a kind of middle course, charging the audience throughout to seek, to see, and to do good. Look into good, see good, do good, be in good, see life. These are all phrases that are used repeatedly throughout the book. Phrases like this are everywhere. They permeate every part of it. They are vital. We get the sense that to enjoy life is to actively seek out what is good in it, to look for good wherever we go, to dwell in good as if it were a habitation. To seek goodness in this way is as basic to life as eating and drinking and companionship. Without enjoyment in this sense, life would simply not be good. One of the other resounding refrains of the book of Ecclesiastes can be found in its statements on labor. So the Hebrew word amal, often translated toil, has the sense of work that is difficult or vexing, work that makes demands on us that perhaps we do not want to accede to. And in the book of Ecclesiastes, this toil is also labored with those tones of hevel, right? Vanity. In chapter 2, the preacher meditates on the nature of work. I quote here, "I made great works. I built houses and planted vineyards for myself. I made gardens and parks and planted in them all kinds of fruit trees. I made pools from which to water the forest of growing trees. I bought male and female slaves and had slaves who were born in my house. I also had great possessions of herds and flocks, more than any who had been before me in Jerusalem. Also, I gathered for myself silver and gold and the treasure of kinds and of provinces," and so on. And then the reflection moves this way. "My heart found pleasure in all my toil, and this was my reward for all my toil. Then I considered all that my hands had done and the toil I had spent in doing it, and again, all was vanity and a chasing after wind. And there was nothing to be gained under the sun." There is a strong sense here that labor is, on the one hand, meaningful. The great works and parks emphasized by the speaker highlight the great wealth and privilege of a royal figure. He is not the slave made to do the hard physical labor, make no mistake. But all the pleasure that such work can yield, and it can yield pleasure, the text tells us, is nevertheless also subject to the tragic conditions of human finitude, and do not in and of themselves provide a structure of meaning that can guard against hevel. In chapter 2, we hear this about toil. "Sometimes one who has toiled with wisdom and knowledge and skill must leave all enjoyed for another who did not toil for it. This also is vanity and a great evil. What do mortals get from all the toil and strain with which they toil under the sun? For all their days are full of pain, and their work is a vexation. Even at night their minds do not rest. This also is vanity." Yet, of course, as we know, Ecclesiastes is a book of contradictions. So immediately follow this observation. The speaker notes, "There is nothing better for mortals than to eat and drink and find enjoyment in their toil. This also I saw is from the hand of God." In other words, for Ecclesiastes, enjoyment and work go hand in hand. Ecclesiastes 5:7-19 emblemizes this dimension. "Besides all their days they eat in darkness, in much vexation and sickness and resentment. This is what I have seen to be good. It is fitting to eat and drink and find enjoyment in all the toil with which one toils under the sun, the few days of the life God gives us, for this is our lot. Likewise, all to whom God gives wealth and possessions, and whom he enables to enjoy them and to accept their lot and find enjoyment in their toil, this is the gift of God." So you see here that enjoyment and toil are side by side. They go hand in hand in the conception of life for Ecclesiastes. To find pleasure in work, this is the meaning of human life. And this is made possible because of the practices of joy, not as a matter of indifference to human suffering, but in a realistic acceptance of the realities of that suffering that attend our lives. To work joyfully, according to Ecclesiastes, is the God-given task, the gift of God, the meaning that we cannot make for ourselves. So this leads us to some freighted ethical choices and are circling back to the theme of the fear of God that's so important in wisdom literature. To choose to live joyfully in light of our circumstances and to take pleasure in our work, despite the fact that it is still toil, Ecclesiastes doesn't let us forget that, is therefore the central ethical choice presented to us in the book of Ecclesiastes. According to that text we just heard, 5:17 through 19, humans are confronted with a freighted ethical choice. Either we can pursue more and more, or we can respond appropriately to opportunities granted by God and to enjoy them. That enjoyment of life is vital for the preservation of life and moral order in the world. To those to whom much is given, what limits will we choose for ourselves? I'm thinking again of the image of the bubbles that the illustrator had us chasing, right? Whether that's fashion or wealth or station in life or fame. What limits will we choose for ourselves instead? How will our decisions to recognize the gift that already exists, the fullness of what already is in this moment, willfully abandoning the pursuit of more, whether that's more wealth, more power, more knowledge, more status, more goods, or more luxuries? This is a question uppermost in mind of the ancient writer, but I think it also has incredibly powerful modern resonances, especially for those of us living in the heretofore unknown affluence of the Western world. How will we willingly embrace limits for ourselves? How will we willingly embrace limits for our communities, for our nation? But this is not simply a matter of human agency. As we've already seen in chapter 3, the preacher is quite clear that it is God who is the doer. God has made everything suitable for its time. It is God's gift that we should all eat and drink. There is in this way a kind of double agency in human life, as there is in human enjoyment as well. We are the doers. We embrace life-affirming behaviors and practices. We choose necessary and life-affirming limits. And yet at the same time, God is the doer. God has made everything suitable. It is God's gift that we eat and drink. This sense of double agency invests humans with an immense ethical responsibility, and at the same time, it releases us from a fantasy of complete control. Earlier, we saw that seeking good and seeing good are part of our human responsibilities in our daily lives. And yet the text also says that the very ability to see good comes from the hand of God. The God who renders this impossibility of grasping eternity is the same God who makes everything possible in its moment. Our enjoyment, in other words, is always contingent upon divine work. It is God's doing that makes our being joyful. Now, the very end of the book offers these summative lines. The end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for that is the whole duty of everyone. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil. Despite all of the complexity of the book, the variability of the dialogue with his own heart, the debates over the vagaries of human life and its tragic potential, despite the regular emphasis on joy, the book ends here with a rather somber tone and a command to fear God and keep his commandments. And this is advice, by the way, that is pretty new from the perspective of the book. It's old from the perspective of wisdom, but it hasn't really been a major theme in the book. This offers kind of a religious coda to a book that has largely not been concerned with the observance of ritual or commandment per se, but rather with the meaning of human life and work. But this reference to the fear of God is also not altogether new. There are 7 references to fearing God in the book of Ecclesiastes. And the fear of God is a wisdom principle in many other texts. It is common in the book of Proverbs, as we already saw in our last session. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. That's Proverbs 1:7. But what does it mean to fear God? Well, I have to tell you, I was curious about how popular culture thinks about the fear of God, so I Googled it. As it turns out, maybe some of you already know this, but this is news to me. Fear of God is a men's high fashion brand, as I myself am not often in the market for $900 sneakers. This came as news to me. But perhaps this is the signal of a cultural sign for us, the kind that would be deeply unsettling to the preacher of Ecclesiastes, I imagine, when fear of God becomes a statement about luxury consumption and not the willing embrace of limits and the worship of God. We are haunted in such moments by that scathing refrain, vanity of vanities. At the same time, fear of God is not mere terror at the sight of something appalling, as it is sometimes caricatured. In the book of Ecclesiastes, to embrace the fear of God means willingly to take up the God-given responsibility of joyful acceptance of limits and fragility, and the embrace of practices of enjoyment and meaningful work in light of them. The fear of God goes hand in hand with the ethics of enjoyment. In doing so, we accept our side with God, who is also the God of the living and calls us to be living ourselves. So taken together then, we might note that the advice of Ecclesiastes is thus neither pessimistic, it's not a counsel of despair, and it's not just wishful thinking, and it's not just a hedonistic call to maximize pleasure and avoid pain. It doesn't counsel us to spiritualize joy to make us impervious to troublesome realities. The ethical thrust of the book nudges us toward the acceptance of human finitude in light of the tragedies of mortality. So enjoyment, like everything else, also has its limitations. The enjoyment of the world shaped by a fear of God requires us to confront life with all its contradictions and contingencies in every moment, both good and bad, as the gift of a mysterious God. So I want to end here with some more questions for reflection. What changes if you think of joy as not just an emotion, but a set of practices? What practices of joy, how have you practiced enjoyment this year? What practices of joy individually or communally might you take up in the days ahead? How does Ecclesiastes' assessment of labor, toil, help or hinder a critique of the culture of work that you find in your parish and or your community? How does it help you reframe your own understanding of meaningful work? And finally, should the final word of Ecclesiastes 12:13 through 14 have the final word? Do you find this to be a persuasive summary of the rest of the book? Fear God and keep his commandments. Why or why not? In what context might it be useful and in what context not? I'm going to stop sharing my screen and put those questions in the chat. But we also have a couple extra minutes if we want to, if there are any, and Amy, I'm looking at you here, if there are comments in the chat that we should, that we could talk about. Or we could just break and go to our chat.
There were a couple of comments from Kathleen Bishop, who said, enjoyment advanced so reminiscent of Siduri, the barman's words in Gilgamesh at the end. Very poignant. And then she also commented, which were eat, drink, and be merry.
Yes, thank you for that connection. I see joy also means awe. I think actually fear also means awe. So when we think about the fear of God, it's also used in the context of worship. To talk about fearing God also means to worship God, which is not a strong emphasis in the book of Ecclesiastes, but it certainly is elsewhere in the canon. So that's an excellent point. Thank you. Is there scholarly thought that the final word is by a different author of the rest of the book? If there is anything that Bible scholars like to do, it's to posit different authors. So yes, that suggestion has been made. It is not a consensus view, but there is a sense that it's kind of an epigram, whether it's by an original hand or an editorial one. It kind of functions to serve as that kind of concluding reflection. Thank you for that question. Yes, Ecclesiastes and Job do tend to serve as reactions against the simplicity of the Proverbs mashals, right? Those two-line sayings that really codify wisdom in a straightforward way. But what's interesting, and I want to affirm that, I think that's exactly what's going on, is moving to a richer, more nuanced dialogue around wisdom. But what it's also doing, I think, is even more subtle than that. And you see it in the book of Ecclesiastes, where it would be simpler for Ecclesiastes merely to reject the proverbial wisdom, but it doesn't do that. It holds, on the one hand, an affirmation of proverbial wisdom and cites it regularly and takes up the themes. But at the same time, it kind of presents them as subjects of speculative thought. So it wants to examine that question and say, the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. Is it? Right? There's an order to the cosmos. Is there? A Kohelet wants to say, right? Ecclesiastes wants to say. So it is, on the one hand, a subversion of the proverbial wisdom tradition, but at the same time, it isn't merely a rejection of it. It's working within the tradition and against it, holding it up to the light for consideration, as it wrestles with it in an ongoing way. But yes, that relationship among the wisdom text is interesting. It's led some people to kind of call proverbial wisdom, what we find in the book of Proverbs, conventional wisdom, and what we find in Job and in Ecclesiastes as this more radical tradition of wisdom. And yes, the serenity of prayer. How do we accept our limits, right? I think that's a beautiful articulation of that sort of principle that you see sort of undergirding much of my reading of the book of Ecclesiastes. How do we accept our finitude and our frailty and our mortality, and also live in the sense of enjoyment, right? The pleasure that is the gift from God. It looks like most people are back. Is that right? Okay, wonderful. Thank you all so much for the opportunity to be here with you. We have just a couple minutes of closing. If there are any further questions or reflections from the small groups, we could talk in a large group for just a moment or two. I'll say just in closing, I do think that there is much in the book of Ecclesiastes to help us think about navigating this season of coronavirus, right? Which, although we are grateful that it may be coming to a place of ease, we're not out of the woods yet, of course, but we've been reminded for this whole year of the problem of mortality and brokenness and isolation. And I hope that Ecclesiastes helps us deal with that in a pretty face-on kind of way that doesn't hide from that reality of mortality and suffering, but also counsels us toward a life of gratitude and enjoyment. Thanks to everyone so much. I hope that the rest of your time together is fruitful. Thanks once again for the invitation.
Thank you so much, Professor James. It really was wonderful. And I hope you take a moment to look at the chat where you're getting a great number of thank yous and appreciation for your time with us today. This was really wonderful. Thank you.
Well, let me add my
wonderful.
Thanks
Thank you all. What a privilege to be with you.
Let me add my thanks to the chat's thanks to Professor Elaine James, who really blessed us this morning. And I think what rich material to choose in this context for us, and your thoughtfulness about those texts was really, I think, a great gift to us all. So thanks so very much for that. And again, thank you, Dr. Hugh Brown and the Clergy Continuing Ed Committee for the work that you've been doing for us to bring good speakers in these events and these occasions to nurture and feed us all. I'm most grateful. I also want to thank Steve Welch for all he does to help coordinate this, and Valerie and the Committee on Liturgy and Music of the Diocese, the Dean and the Cathedral, Dr. Kerry Hyman's here playing, and so we give great thanks for that. He's about to celebrate a big birthday, so we hold him in prayer and celebrate to get him through it, He's over there smiling.